Welcome to today's program, AI Assisted Deals, Contract Drafting, Due Diligence, and Deal Management. I'm Ala Policastro, Director of Education and Professional Development at Beverly Hills Bar Association, and today I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Stephen Smith. Stephen focuses on helping law firms turn AI from buzzwords into billable outcomes. He is the CEO of Intelligence by Intent, where he provides AI strategy advisory and training to law firms and professional services organizations. He has delivered AI training and strategic guidance to over 1,000 organizations with a focus on practical adoption, governance, and measurable ROI rather than just theoretical overview. Stephen brings over 25 years of executive leadership experience, including CFO and SVP of revenue operations roles at multiple organizations, and strategy partner roles at IBM Global Services and TCG Advisors, where he developed growth strategies for Fortune 100 technology companies. Stephen holds an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and authors Intelligence by Intent newsletter at smithstephen.com. We're so excited to have him back here once again, so I am now turning it over to him.
Great. Thank you, Ala. Let me share my screen. I apologize in advance that my camera decided to not be working today, but I'm excited to be here, and I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome. So as Ala said, look, who I am. At this point, I've trained over 3,000 attorneys on AI strategy and implementation. I've been a keynote speaker. I've been doing a lot of this executive leadership work for the better part of 25 years. But the last several years, I've really focused on law firms and how law firms and lawyers can use AI. So before I jump into the transaction section today, there's something I wanted to share. So turns out yesterday, ChatGPT launched a brand new image model, their Images 2.0. And for those of you that have ever tried to do images in ChatGPT or Gemini or others, you know that it can do a pretty good job, but it was never amazing. Well, I want to let you know that they actually went from pretty good to absolutely amazing yesterday. So I just wanted to take a minute because I know this actually is quite relevant to a lot of the folks on the call to show you a couple of things it can do. So there are a ton of legal use cases for using images, right? You've got litigation demonstrations. You can create timelines. You can create storyboards. You can create entity control charts. It's great for client communication, right? Creating explanatory graphics, CLE and internal training, et cetera, et cetera. So I put together 5 really quick demos just to show you things that it can do. And I'm happy to share the prompts and things like that too. So one thing I did was I said, hey, let's go create an infographic about the Beverly Hills Bar Association, right? And I gave it a pretty simple prompt and said, go create me an infographic. And as I said, the thing that's new and unique now is the text you will find on these is perfect. They just don't make any errors like they used to. And again, this was from a pretty simple prompt. I gave another one that said, go create an illustrative storyboard for an accident. So it actually created all these images. It created the text in the images, right? With some simple prompting from what I did. Maybe you've got an example where you're trying to explain, and this is relevant in the transaction side, entity control charts, right? Let's say you're dealing a transaction with a very complex entity. You've got different ownership in Harbor Peak Holdings, and then Harbor Peak has different ownership in different organizations like Bluestone and Cedar Analytics and things like that. So again, these are really simple prompts, but you get absolutely incredible output. Or maybe you want to create a chronology or a timeline around trade secret disputes. And again, all this text came from simple things. Or maybe, for example, you want to create internal training materials for CLE training, or to teach your internal staff about which AI tools to use and not to use, right? So here's an example where I said, I want you to go create a 6-panel conversation where it starts with someone entering stuff into a personal AI account versus a commercial AI account. The partner has a conversation with them. Then we talk about, privilege and confidentiality and things like that. So I just wanted to highlight this because this just launched yesterday, and it's really relevant to a lot of the organizations that I work with on a regular basis. So one thing I want to mention is Claude 4.7 launched a couple of weeks ago. It is currently Anthropic's best model. I've also run all these examples in ChatGPT, but for purposes of demos today, I want to keep it pretty simple. And I want to run all these and show you the examples in Anthropic's Claude 4.7 model. And I use the Opus model, their most advanced reasoning model. So some of the reasons I do this, it handles very, very long documents and does long coherent reasoning really well. So it can hold a 50-page credit agreement and with full financials and working memory and work across all those agreements. It is much, much stronger at financial math. And it is very good at understanding terms and numbering schemes and keeping formatting in documents. I did a session earlier this week around the new Claude add-in for Microsoft Word. It is great at tracking changes and doing things, and you'll see examples of that today. And just one last thing I will mention, since I was talking about ChatGPT a second ago, they are expected to launch their new flagship model tomorrow, 5.5. So I expect big improvements in what they're doing as well. But any one of the examples we talk about today in transactions, you can do in ChatGPT, you can do in Anthropic, you could do them in Gemini as well. So I want to touch briefly on privacy. I do talk about this in every presentation I give. This is incredibly important for law firms, especially if you saw the announcements yesterday. One of the very big bankruptcy organizations got in trouble in the federal courts. But let's talk about this. There's a couple different use cases, right? There are free and consumer-based tools. They're the free and the pro ones. Please do not use those for anything legal related, even though you can technically turn off training. Third parties can access that data, so don't you be using the free or the consumer grade tools, right? Whether you're using Gemini or ChatGPT or the Claude models from Anthropic, they have teams or business or enterprise tiers. Please use those all the time. You get complete confidentiality, you get privacy, there was no third-party access to the tools, you get things like SOC 2 compliance, and they are contractually obligated not to train on your data. So again, this is appropriate for transactional work and for other kinds of legal work. Please, 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 if you remember, one thing, do not use the consumer grade tools. So you can put client confidential data in Teams and enterprise tools. And the last really important thing I tell everybody, and this is where people get in trouble, is every output that comes out of an AI has to be human reviewed before it leaves your office. So, there's the rule 1.1 on competence. That applies to every AI assisted deliverable. You are the lawyer, the tool is not. AI doesn't have a bar number and you do. So please, please, please use the right tools when you're using these things. They can do amazing things. So let's jump into the heart of this. Let's jump into the transactional arc, and I called it in 3 acts. So as I said, every demo today, plugs into one of these 3 phases. I'm going to talk about drafting first and foremost, right? We can look at term sheets, playbooks, we can do redlinings, we can review counterparty markups, we can create, risk-rated change logs, we can do all sorts of interesting things, and I'll show you demos of these. On the diligence side, we can do risk review and verification, right? It can read the entire documents, it can catch what matters, it can surface risks across these documents. And then we'll talk about sort of the closing act in these documents, right? Deal management and regulatory issues. And I've got interactive graphics for some of these. I've got red lines for a lot of these. And again, I'm happy to take questions as we go through this, but I do want to take the time to show you what can happen here. So one of the things I am going to highlight, since I'm using Claude, and I'm going to switch to Claude for a second here, is Claude actually has several tools in it. And this is part of the desktop app. So many people are probably very familiar with the Claude chat app, on the web browser, which I use all the time. And I've got all these different projects in here. And let me just get back into this one. But there also is a desktop app, which has the complete chat interface. So all the conversations you've been having are here as well. And they have something called Cowork. And Cowork is something I use for some of these demos. And let me go back now to the presentation and talk about what these do, right? So Cowork, if I talk about this for a second, is an agentic tool case. It actually lets you operate on dozens or hundreds of documents at a time. So normally when you're using, the Claude AI chat, if you want to work on a document, you have to upload that document, you have a conversation on that document, and typically you get one document or maybe a couple of documents back. When you're using Claude Cowork, you get access to the same models. In fact, you actually get access to a couple models that you can't get to in the Claude AI chat. And it allows you to operate on multiple documents at one time. You can actually give it a ton of steps. You can say, do these 5 things on these documents, combine these documents, read these, turn these into PDFs. It gives you a ton more flexibility. This isn't going to really be a training tool on that per se today, but I want you to be aware that there are different tools now that you can use that give you different capabilities. And I tried to outline some of the really simple examples here as you go forward and do these. So I'm going to bounce back and forth in the different examples, but I want you to be able to see what you can do there. So let's start by talking about drafting and document review. And so the first use case is, and I covered this a little bit on Monday in the Claude add-in for Microsoft Word, is doing contract redlining, right? So let's say, for example, a counterparty returns your template MSA marked up with 40 changes, across a bunch of areas, indemnification, liability caps, IP assignment, et cetera, right? You got to look at those changes, figure out, what the risk impact is. Do you want to accept them? Do you want to reject them? Do you want to counter those things? And you typically have quite tight deadlines. And so what you can do is you can drop the original template and the counterparty's red lines into Claude Cowork. You can put it at a directory, and you're going to get back a structured analysis of every change with risk ratings, right? Business impact and recommended responses. So what I want to do is show you the prompts that I used for these, because this is where I think a lot of this becomes very useful. So I've created a separate document, and I'm happy to share this with people. But what you'll see here is when most people are learning to use ChatGPT or Claude, they develop relatively simple prompts. These tools now today can take very, very advanced prompts with a ton of different steps and a ton of different actions. And so what I basically told it to do is, hey, I'm going to give you two different documents, the original MSA and the counterparty's red lines, right? Where they've actually given me a text document back and they've added and they've deleted things. So what matters here is we want to focus on the substantive changes. We need to know, what did they change? How much does it hurt us? Why did they probably ask for us? And what do we say back? So I'm not going to read everything in the prompt, but I just want to show you a couple of these prompts to go through here. So what I want Claude to produce is a single analysis, right? Organized around red lines. For each material change, show me the original language, the new language, the section of the document, what the counterparty is trying to accomplish, how this shifts risks or economics, and our recommended response, right? Accept, pushback, reject. Why we want to do this, where the market practice, supports the counterparty, say so. If not, let's make negotiations and arguments on our side. Then to calibrate it, quote the language verbatim, don't paraphrase things because we lose the argument when we go to negotiation. Flag when a clause looks fine in isolation but interacts badly with other clauses. So this is a relatively complex prompt that you can give. And again, these tools, 6 months ago, a year ago, you could not have given the tool this. It would not have followed all the steps. Today, it can do all these things. So if I go into Cowork here, and I'm going to go look at number one, analyze the MSA red lines. So what you'll see here is I dumped the prompt in up top, just like you saw there. I gave the two original documents, and I went through some analysis. And what I've got here then is a red line document that you'll see here with all of the information back that they gave me. So here's the original MSA, here's the scope of services. And because this tool can now do red lines, right, I've got all the information in here. Now it's hard to see all the commentary in here. I'm going to go ahead and just open up the Word document. So you can see here that Claude actually went through and looked at all the commentary in here, all the red lines, all the changes, and actually did all those things I asked for, right? Granted, they pushed back, pushed net 30 to net 60. The risk is a 2 to 3% financing cost plus collection risk, right? Let's counter with net 45 and a 15-day dispute notice window. So all those things that I asked for, Claude went through and did. So it actually can do a really, really amazing job analyzing terms. And if you'd had standard terms or things that you like to use, you could have uploaded that document as well. But I just want to show you that it has a tremendous amount of capability to go through and do that and push back and make changes. And the really nice part about Claude versus ChatGPT is Claude does an outstanding example right now of really using the capabilities of Microsoft Word, which a lot of us work in, and doing track changes and putting comments and following all the rules and keeping edits and things like that. So one thing you'll notice here is it actually is notated here as Claude in the commentary. If you were to do this natively in Microsoft Word, because you'll see here I've got a little Claude option here. Let's go ahead and restart the add-in. If I were to tell it in here now to make changes, it would actually show up as my name as Steve Smith versus as Claude. So those are things you can tailor and tweak. And I could have given it instructions, hey, don't say it's from Claude, say it's from Steve Smith, and it would do that for you too. But just be aware of that as you go through this. So again, that's a great use case for something that you can do there in terms of actually, using Claude and going through that in terms of doing contract redline reviews. So I put the prompt in here. Like I said, I've got a full document with each one of the prompts. In the slides that you're going to get, I think I only put the two first examples of prompts in there, but you can see how it's structured, right? Contract redline analysis, what matters, what to produce, and then the calibration that I want you to focus on. So another good example is term sheets, right? We've negotiated a joint venture term sheet. It runs about 5 pages of compressed bullets. The definitive operating agreement needs about 60 pages of defined terms, reps and warranties, indemnification, dispute resolution, exit mechanics, all the things that eats a tremendous amount of time, right? What we want to get back is a first draft LLC operating agreement. We want every term sheet bullet mapped to, definitive sections. We want bracketed alternatives, things like that. So again, I actually did this one in chat because I built some interactive things as well. But what I want to get back is a signed term sheet and ask for, a first draft definitive agreement. Claude looks at every business point, turns it into full contractual provisions, adds standard protective language, around the entire agreement. And depending on which county you're in, which state you're in, you can, of course, define, which sets of rules to use, or if you got, again, existing language you want to use, you can put that in there as well. So the prompt for this one, if I go look at number 2 here, was, our client has signed the attached joint venture term sheet, draft a complete first draft LLC operating agreement based on that term sheet. What the partner needs back, right? A complete professionally formatted LLC operating agreement that honors every term in the sheet, fills in everything the term sheet was silent on with standard protective provisions, and makes clear where the draft goes beyond the term sheet. So then I tell it, hey, I want you to draft the agreement, do all these different things, flag where the client needs input, right? If we have gaps or ambiguities, why this matters in practice, take 2 or 3 possible approaches with pros and cons. Then I want you to draft a coverage memo, for the client that talks about these different things, then a little bit of calibration language again. So again, much more complex prompts than you could do a while ago. And so if I go now into Claude here, I've got this one. This is number 2, the operating agreement. So I'm going to go ahead, come down here and load this up. Let me just go scroll down here. So here is the operating agreement that it created. So it went through from the original term sheets, and let's let this get loaded here, right? And it created a, 40 or 50 page LLC operating agreement, right? So it's got all the different sections in here, first draft for partner review, and this has got the table of contents. If I actually open this up as a Word document here, I'm going to go ahead and open it up, and let's get this. What you'll see here is, yes, I want to use this. It actually, will create the table of contents automatically. It didn't show that in the other one, but I wanted to show you that it actually does that here. So as you go through and it has all the pages and things like that, it will update things. I didn't hit it update on here, so it didn't do the pages, but in the official one, it will actually do it. But you get all the terms and all the definitions, right? Again, a very, very lengthy document here that it created from all the terms. It added notes in here, for the partners to go look at, things to focus on. And the other thing that it created, let me minimize this one here as well. Let me go back into the chat here, is it created that memo document for me for the client. And so this is a really interesting way to look at this is, hey, the client, what are the things you have to focus on? What do you want to do? It marks it as attorney work project. So this memorandum accompanies the first draft of this LLC operating agreement, things to focus on, client input terms. Again, this is not the final version that you would ever give to a client, but it gives you an incredible jumpstart and starts to showcase, what these different tools can do. And then one of the great things that Claude can do is it can create these interactive agreements. And so I told it basically, I want you to be able to compare the operating agreement and the term sheet, right, that came out there. So if they wanted to pull up the term sheet, the parties and structure, right, what sections show up in the definitive agreement where those same things are? So entity, business, and taxation shows up here in the organization and capital section. Sentinel contributions show up in members and capital. So as a way to kind of compare across documents, right, if you've got like a detailed term sheet definitive agreement, you can actually visually show that here, in Claude is something called an artifact. And, the instructions to create it are pretty easy. I said, I want you to create a dual pane coverage map. The left pane shows the term sheet with each provision numbered. The right pane shows the definitive agreement, and then highlight back and forth and show me those things. So again, when you're sitting down with, a client and you want to be able to say, okay, here's where this was here, here's where this is here. It's a great way to visualize that and see where that is. So again, I did include the prompt here. You can see this one gets a little bit longer, which is why I created a separate doc for it. But I want you to be able to see this to get a sense of how you can prompt these tools and what you can do here. So another good example in this section is around disclosure schedule drafting, right? This is one of the most tedious deliverables in M&A, and I've done a bunch of M&A in the past, right? So we want to be able to cross-reference, reps and warranties against the company's actual facts. We want to pull different sources from different data rooms, corporate records, client interviews, right? We get all this different information in here. And at the end, what we want is we want to be able to load the purchase agreement and the deal records, right? And again, you can upload hundreds of records if you're using Cowork because you can point it at a directory. We want to create a full disclosure with language and delivery schedules. We want to cross-reference items that belong in multiple schedules. We want to flag disclosures that could trigger, buyer termination or indemnity rights and issues for us. So I'm going to go over to Cowork here. Let me go back here. This is number 3. If I go load up number 3 here, and what you'll see, again, I uploaded the sample data. I dropped in the prompt. I want you to prepare this for me. It did it again as a Word document. And the nice thing is I didn't actually have to tell it to create it as a Word document. It knows to do this natively. So it went through, it created this disclosure schedules here, right? Here's all the contents in the document. And again, it created all this manually based on the prompts and what it did. Here's the preamble, the general provisions and schedules. So again, I'm just going to scroll through this to show you some of the things that you can do here. I actually like that it creates, these schedules of all the different areas. So it is incredibly detailed. You can give it the different language. You can give it the different, requirements as to what should be in here. And I didn't give it that specific structure. I let it just go on what it's trained on. But again, it's incredibly knowledgeable about what's in here. And if I hit Microsoft Word here, it will again open up the document. And if it had track changes and different comments and things like that, that would actually show up here on the right-hand side. So again, a very useful way for this to go through here and do this. So let me shut this one down as well. And this one, because I don't need all these different Word docs open. And let's go back to the presentation and we'll keep going on it. So here's another one that takes a tremendous amount of time for firms to do. And this is maintaining clause libraries, right? So when you've got tons and tons of terms that you use across all these agreements, right? You want terms that are tailored to the buyer, terms that are tailored to the seller, terms that are, favorable to different parties. And you might want to have things in there around HIPAA compliance and SOC 2 compliance. And maintaining this, especially as you get longer and longer documents, gets to be an incredibly onerous proposition. And so the prompt for this, if we go into I think I did number 3. If we go into the SaaS clause library here, right? I wanted to build a reusable SaaS clause library for vendor agreements, right? The library should be used for transactional associates at a firm that represents SaaS vendors and enterprise customers, right? I want to pick a starting point in provisions. I want to understand at one glance what makes each variation favorable or balanced. I've got all these different categories, and I had hundreds and hundreds of terms in here that I wanted to go through. So then I said, for each variation, do the following things, right? What makes this version favor one side? Point to specific language. When should an associate pick this variation, right? Deal size, leverage, customer profiles. We're trying to, again, build a knowledge base that helps your associates and your team get smarter about when to use these things. Because especially as AI starts to deliver more and more content, we want to make sure that we're training everybody to use these tools and actually understand how to make better decisions, right? So again, there's a lot more content in here. But I'm going to go ahead and jump back in. If I go look here, this is a chat one. So I'm going to go into the chat here. I'm going to go into, let me exit out of this. Let me go into number 4, the SaaS clause library for vendor agreements, and show you what it created here. So I'm going to go open this up as a Word doc. And this is something, as I said, that could not have been done earlier. The length of the analysis that had to happen across this, I actually had to run this twice in order to get it to run properly. But what you'll see here is this is now creating a standardized library that you can use. And we've got different tiers. We've got vendor favorable terms. We've got balanced ones. We have customer favorable ones. So here's a bunch of common terms throughout the agreement. And again, it created definitions for all these things. And you can obviously go tweak these things and change these things. But now we've got things like data security and breach notifications, right? Here are the regulatory drivers. And then we have a vendor favorable variation, right? So here's 1.1 on this one. So the vendor shall implement and maintain commercially reasonable administrative, physical, and technical safeguards, on and on and on. Why it favors the vendor, it tells us this, right? When should we pick this variation? With small dollar customers under 50K ARR, we have month-to-month contracts. And then if we have to counter, here's a realistic counter on doing these things. Here is a balanced variation on this document, right? Where it favors both the vendor and the customer pretty equally. So language for that, why this is balanced, when would we pick this variation? And here's one that's a customer favorable variation, right? Vendors shall implement the following things and go on and on and on. So this became, as you can see here, an extraordinarily lengthy document. There's stuff, there's stuff on healthcare, financial services, how to negotiate these different things. So this, again, how we do SLAs and, what you want to have in here. So this again created a very, very detailed document that becomes a tremendous resource for, for the folks working on these deals, the attorneys, the investment bankers and things like that, that you can use and you can easily swap in and out of language. And one of the things I did, just again to show you the impact of artifacts, is I wanted to be able to sort of compare clauses here. And I did this visually where I said, okay, hey, I've got these different sections. We got, limitations liability clause, we've got SLA clauses, IP ownership clauses. So if I drop in IP ownership here, it shows me the clauses. Here's the vendor favorable clause, here's the balance clause, here's the customer favorable one. And then if I look and say, hey, how does this balance out here? If I say, if it's all vendor on this one, I pick the vendor one, basically it's going to show me, hey, here's, vendor liability exposure, vendor operational flexibility. It ranks these, sort of high or low on these. So it gives me a visual representation as I go through this. I don't know how often I would use this, but I wanted to be able to show you that you can actually change these and see visually what this means. So if you're explaining to a client or, to someone you're negotiating with why you're changing this, you can show how, hey, this one's more balanced. Here's how many clauses are favorable to you or disfavorable to us or things like that. So again, another very powerful use case. So here's another great example. I've actually used this with a lot of organizations doing commercial lease analysis. So, oftentimes you have to, review dozens of provisions against tenant interests, CAM charges, exclusivity, assignment rights, renewal options, things like that. We can upload the lease into Cloud Cowork, or you can point it at a directory. And especially if you've had multiple leases in the past, you could have it do historical comparisons and things like that. But what we want to get is a tenant-focused, risk register organized by severity, and looking at market standard benchmarks for the submarket, drafted revision language for every problem issue, and list of protections the tenant should be looking for, but might not have been offered. So we want to get this, again, a tenant-focused risk flagging document, right? Market standard benchmarking, specific revisions, things like that. So if I go back over into the prompt here, just so you can see this, if we go look at number 5, I'm going to basically tell it, hey, the attached commercial lease is being reviewed for the tenant. Produce a risk analysis and negotiation plan that our client can use to mark up the landlord's draft. So it gives me a little bit of information. This is Portland Class A office space. Assume this kind of growth rates and things like that. What I want you to produce, right? The economics in plain numbers, base rents, NNN estimates, tenant improvement allowances. What are the risks worth negotiating? This is really important, right? I want you to quote verbatim on these issues. I want to identify specific exposures and dollars, suggest replacement language, give me material protections, things like that. So again, very, very detailed prompts. And I hope that these, as you go forward, will become very useful in what you do. So if I go over here and we go look at the lease here, let's go open this up. Let me go grab this lease over here. I'm going to actually open it up in Microsoft Word so you can see the more detailed version. So here's the tenant side risk, right? So here's the client memo up front. So I did tell at the end, hey, I want you to create a client memo about this, right? This landlord form is materially off market for Portland Class A space, right? So up front, let's talk about what the issues are. There's 3 big economic issues. There's 3 legal issues that we want to highlight, some recommended posture for the counter offer, and what we do. So again, and then I had to create tables, right? Here's the economics in plain numbers that you saw what I asked for, right? The premises, the initial term, the base rents. It's great at creating tables. It's great at creating insights. If I had uploaded a spreadsheet of current market data, it could have referenced that. So again, these tools are amazing at pulling these different things together and making this happen. Here's the risk analysis by section, some suggested replacement language, no audit rights, things like that. So again, clawbacks, all the things that you would expect to see if you were negotiating a commercial lease as you go forward here. So again, another really powerful use case for what these tools can do. So let's go over to due diligence. And this is another area where these tools are amazingly useful in doing transactions. And so, as I said, I've done a bunch of M&A, and a lot of times an acquisition generates, 500 to 2,000 documents, right? If you ever worked in a deal room, you've seen the volume of documents that you can get there, right? Associates can spend hours and hours and hours reviewing financial statements, material contracts, corporate records, pulling all this information out. right? And what I would want to do is I would take Cowork and I would point it at basically at a deal room or a directory that has all the financial statements, all the material contracts, all the corporate records, and basically have Claude produce a structured financial analysis with anomaly flagging and contract risks and the matrices of what's going on here. So the prompt that I use for this, if we go look at number 6 here, is, in this case, I only had 3 documents because again, all these were sample examples for what I had created here, right? But I've got the target company financials, 3 years of that. I've got material contract summaries, right? 8 different key agreements. I've got a corporate record summary. And I want you to produce a buy side due diligence memo that the deal team can walk into a pricing discussion with, right? So what does the team need, right? The partner has to look at these things. Does this deal still make sense at the stated price, or do we have some pricing leverage now, right? What do we need to change in the purchase agreement? The reps, the indemnities, escrow, whatever they happen to be. And importantly, are there any findings that are actual deal breakers, right? And which findings should be handled with disclosure? So what we wanted to produce, a single integrated memo. The reader should be able to, move top to bottom, understand the deal in detail. We want to cover the following things, right? We want to cover financial health. We want to cover material contract risk, corporate governance and capitalization, consolidated findings, deal term recommendations, executive summary for the deal team. Obviously, we want to have things like EBITDA in there, right? And then we calibrate on a couple different things in here. So again, a very detailed prompt about what we want to cover. So I did this one again in Cowork. So let me pop over into Cowork so you can again see what this looks like. So if we go in here into the due diligence, and you'll see again, I dropped in the sample documents, I dropped in that prompt, right? You can see the process it goes through. And one thing, I didn't highlight this earlier, but what Cowork does when you give it a set of instructions, it will actually list out all the instructions it's required in order to do the analysis that you're asking for. And as it goes through all of those, it actually marks off progress and does things. It will show you where it created things. It has scratch pads. It looks at all the context. And if you've used skills like Excel skills or document skills, it actually shows all that stuff there as well. So you can actually see the work that Claude is doing for you, which again becomes very, very useful for a lot of what's going on here. So here again is the document. I'll open it up in Word again. Let me go ahead and allow this. Right. So the privileged and confidential document for Helix software, right? Bottom line, recommendation, proceed with the conditions. Helix is a real business. It grew revenue 80%, 87% over 3 years. It's running at a 24%, operating margin. It carries no debt. 3 findings that drive the decision, right? FinServ Bank is operating without a contract, these different things. Here's a pricing view. What walks the deal, right? No written net core consent and amendment by signing, right? There's no credible replacement plan. So you can see what's in here, what gets repriced, repped or escrowed if it's not walked. So again, very top thing. So top 10 findings for the deal team, right? So again, it creates a super nice structured table here. It creates the kind of output that, you're going to have a whole team do. And again, I want to emphasize, humans have to review this data, right? These AI tools can make mistakes. They can hallucinate. They are markedly better than they ever used to be, but they, again, can still make mistakes as they go through this. But again, you have findings, the quantified impact, the actions, right? So honorable mentions, a couple of different things that are in there. Here's the financial analysis we asked for, operating income, operating margin. Here's the normalized EBITDA that I asked for at the end. So you can see this is a lengthy document, and all this was created from working documents. So you can point it at a deal team. And again, ChatGPT can do the same thing, although I'll honestly say at least the current version 5.4, and I don't know how 5.5 will be tomorrow, it does not produce as beautifully formatted of documents as Claude does right now. I mean, Claude does an amazing job in Opus 4.6 or Opus 4.7. It takes a fair amount of time to crunch through all this stuff, but you get really, really tremendous output as you go through here. So again, trying to highlight some good examples and some good prompts that you can use. So here's another one. You want to do loan covenant analysis, right? So credit agreements demand that lawyers operate at the intersection of legal drafting and financial modeling. One of the things I covered in the Monday session was that there is, as I said, this Claude add-in for Microsoft Word. There is also a Claude add-in for Excel. And these documents can talk to each other. So if you have a Word doc that's open with the Claude add-in, and if you have an Excel document that's open with the Claude add-in, you can actually have these documents reference each other and pull data back and forth. It becomes a very, very powerful use case. But what we want to do in this example is, we want to share a draft credit agreement and the borrower's recent financials. Claude returns every financial covenant with its formula. We get current compliance shown step by step. We want headroom. We want to stress test the scenarios. We want to, identify again errors and flags. So fully extract financial covenants and the formulas, right? We want compliance calculations with the math shown step by step. We want to go do all this stuff. So let's go back over into Cowork here and let's go look at example 7. And again, I know I'm going through a lot of this stuff relatively fast, but what I want to be able to do is show you at the end here, or make sure we have time for questions. So the first thing I want to show you is, from this analysis, it actually created 3 documents for me, right? It created an analysis memo. It created an Excel spreadsheet, which is the covenant dashboard, which I'm going to open up first. And then it created a compliance certificate template. I'm going to go look at this one, and I'm going to go ahead and just have it open this up directly in Excel. So there was no Excel spreadsheet initially that I created. And as I'm saying, Claude is now fantastic at creating Excel spreadsheets and creating formulas and doing things. So we created everything here. So this was my dashboard, right? So we've got a couple of the areas that were in breach here, and you'll see that in the Word documents as well. But it did a complete EBITDA build here on the table, right? It identified the reference notes. It did a debt build for me as well in this table. You can see all this information here. It actually created a stress case, right? So we've got all the different lines here. We've got the actual trailing 12 months. We've got the stress case, right? What the delta is, what happens here as we go through this, right? What happens in the different covenant outcomes, right? What about breach detection timing on all these different things? So again, these are all things that a seasoned lawyer and an investment banking team would go through and figure out. But this really helps you get jump started as you go through this kind of analysis, right? And then some seller's notes on some of the things that we would want to go cross-check. And if I go back into Cowork here, and we get the analysis memo. I'll just let this load up here. So, here's the document it created. Here's the information about the deal, right? It started out with, some critical findings. The borrower cannot certify compliance at closing, right? The subordinated seller note is also in breach, right? So these are things that obviously we would want to highlight very, very quickly upfront if we were to try and go through and do a deal like this, right? So top negotiating points in the markup. Here's the scorecard. And if you remember what we saw in that spreadsheet a second ago, right? It looked very much like this table, but here's a version that's now sitting in a Word document. And as I said, if you open those up, you can actually paste information back and forth. You could incorporate things. So here's, the covenant package inventory that we would want to focus on, right? Negative covenants and the issues on here. So I'm not going to go through all this, but you can recreate these things and see these things. And here's all the compliance calculations. So this is really important, right? How do we get to the adjusted EBITDA build, right? Seeing this level of detail is super, super important. And it was great not to have it just in the spreadsheet, but really important to also have it in this Word doc so I can actually see what's happening here. And again, Claude went through, it built all this stuff for me. It did an absolutely fantastic job of identifying these things and going through here. And so what I want to do for 1 second before I jump onto the next example is this was number 7. And so I want to show you, you know what? I actually didn't save. Let me see if I saved the ChatGPT one here for number 7. I don't know if I actually did. Here's the loan covenant analysis. Let me see if I can get this loaded up here. Oh, so this is ChatGPT's output. And so when I talk about seeing the quality of the different outputs, right? So I gave it the same prompt. I gave it the same original files. And instead of creating a Word document, ChatGPT actually just did inline here in the chat. So a lot of the information is very similar. It identified which ones are in breach. So the analysis, again, is quite similar. It has the adjusted EBITDA buildup here. But my take, being an end user of these tools all the time, is I actually find that this to be a much more useful and elegant output, and having the Word doc and having the Excel files in this. Now, at the end of this, I could tell ChatGPT, hey, I want you to go create an Excel file and I want you to create a Word doc, and it would do that. But the fact that Claude natively creates that up front for me, to me, is much, much more valuable than than sort of seeing it here and copying it, pasting it out, and maybe making errors and things like that. But there's the compliance certificate. So if I go back to Cowork, that was the other thing that it had created here. It created this nice compliance certificate. So as you saw, ChatGPT created a pretty simple version, and here is a much nicer looking one. Again, nicely formatted. We can drop information in here. It's just much easier and much, to me, much more professional looking than what I got out of the other tool. So I have 2 more quick examples that I want to show you. Three more, sorry. So let's talk about deal management now and regulatory issues. So three more examples, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end here. So this one is regulatory compliance screening, right? So oftentimes if you're doing an M&A deal, it requires a lot of regulatory organizations that you got to look at, right? You've got, HSR, you got CFIUS, you got, Team Telecom, FCC. You may have state organizations you got to get regulation from if you got international ones. So, the challenge we have is, we want to share a deal memo with Claude and say, we want to get a full regulatory map, right? What do we have to do? What are the implications? What is the timing on this? And again, you have to check all the data, but it does an incredible job of starting the process and doing it. And this one actually created a really interesting visual that I want to show you as well that shows the impacts of different things on timing when you want to go do this. So if I pop over to Claude here, and let me exit out of this and go out of here, and you go to number 8, the deal memo. So again, I have uploaded the deal memo, I've uploaded the instructions, and what I'm going to get back here, if I come down to this one, this one here. Here is my project roadmap. And so it again created, let me scroll all the way up to the top here, right? A very detailed regulatory roadmap, right? So here's what we got to do for the California CPUC, right? Here's these different other ones, the voluntary notice, right? The UK one that we got to focus on. We've got to look at these other things as well, right? Here's some assumptions and missing facts, right? So, Berliner Capital receives no Apex board seat, observer rights or information rights. So if we're going to do these things, we have to go take a look at this. So this identified a ton of issues in here, right? Here's missing facts that the deal team should confirm before filings go in, right? What federal approvals do we have to do? Here's timing, filing postures. So again, it's an incredible starting point. It's not going to replace the expertise that your deal team has and all of your experts have. But again, it gives you a great jump start and a great base to work on. And I really like this. Here's timing on these things, typical timelines for different states and things that you've got to go through, what's on the critical path. So again, I'm going to scroll to the bottom. Here's the filing by filing timing, when we have to do different things. File it by this date. When do we expect it to clear by? So again, a really useful output that would take someone a fair amount of time to go put into this. Likely outcomes, strategy recommendations, drafted documents. Again, a huge, who's responsible for doing these things, by the way, Apex, the buyer, or is it the seller, things like that, that's got to go through here. And the other thing that was really interesting is I asked it to create a Gantt chart for me so I could look at the timing of this. So again, this is something that Claude is amazing at doing. I basically said, I want you to create a Gantt chart of visuals that shows me what's on the critical timeline. So what happens is I do these different filings, right? So here's the HSR filing, here's the CFIUS filing, the DCSA filing, the FCC filing, and it's got the timeline here from May all the way through January of 27, right? And if something goes outside the date. So if something happens, so if this filing goes plus 45 days, I can click this and you can see here, hey, this doesn't really materially impact what I got going on here. If the UK one goes longer, right, which is further down here, right, that added this timing, that doesn't do it. However, if the CPUC one goes an additional 90 days, you'll see here, now I'm in the danger zone. So I can actually visually see what's happening here in these filings. So again, it's a great way to look and see what's happening and figure out, what are your critical dependencies and sort of show people visually, all right, we got to make sure we're on top of this one because this is the one that's critical to make sure that nothing else goes awry or goes sideways in this particular deal. So two other quick examples, creating a deal closing checklist and timeline, right? So we're doing a mid-market closing. There's hundreds of deliverables across 8 to 12 work streams. And so what we want to do is we want to get deal status, target close dates. We want to have a master checklist by work stream, any dependencies, things like that. So again, we want to get a master checklist. We want to get a dependency map. We want to get items flagged that might be blocking. So we're going to go back into the chat here. This one's number 9. And actually, let me show you the prompt here. I know I skipped a couple of these prompts, but again, if people want these, please reach out to me. I'm happy to share these. Here's my deal closing checklist, right? What does the partner need, right? What is left to close? Who owns each item? What is actually blocking progress right now? Can we still hit the target closing date? If not, what has to change? And what are the risks that could blow up this deal in the last 2 weeks if they're not addressed now, right? Produce all the following things: a complete closing checklist, right? Responsibility distribution, dependencies, critical paths, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to go show you this. Let's go into number 9. And I'm going to come down here. I think I also, yeah, I did it also a visual, but I want to focus more on this. This is the more important piece here. So I'm going to open this up actually as a Word doc. Let's just open this up here. It's just, again, easier to see what we've got here. So the transaction value, the current target close date, right? Here's the contents, the executive summary. What's critical, right? We've got 11 things that are critical, 23 that are at risk, 27 on, on track. But I care about the ones that are going to be a problem, right? Move the target close date to July 27. June 1st is not achievable. So just knowing this up front is hugely important, right? What are some of the, what are the binding constraint or the secondary constraints? What are the issues we have to go focus on, right? Number one risk, number two risk, things like that. So it gives me really good practical insights about the deal and what I have to focus on. So again, it just saves tremendous amount of time. The fact that it can look across all these insights, all these deals, all these different things really, really gives me a very valuable way of figuring out, what has to happen in these deals. And again, I said this probably 5 times already. Please make sure you do human review. These things can make mistakes, but as a starting point, it is tremendously, tremendously powerful for what you're trying to do. If I keep going, right, here's critical path analysis, right? There's just all these different things that would take a tremendous amount of time, but are critical in doing a big deal. The distribution of responsibility, like who's got things that are due here. So again, it would take me quite a while to put a chart like this together. So it's a really great way of saying, okay, who owns what? How do we get information to them and make sure that this stuff can actually get closed on time so that we can actually get this deal done and make this deal happen? Oh, actually, the last thing I was just going to show you in there was, as I said, I created a visualization here. I just think it's useful to see some of these things. So I actually had it look across the entire project here and say, okay, what is tied to what in these deals? So if you click on something like the BCS consent is tied to the commercial threshold, so you can sort of see what different dependencies are and like what's tied to what as you do a deal here. So again, I don't know how often you would do this. I am a very visual person, but the fact that I can simply ask it to create something very visual like this to then show people and be able to look at that stuff. And, here's the closing day hour by hour view, which again, I also thought was very, very useful to look at this. It created my swim lane. So I can say, hey, who owns what? When does this have to get done? And how do I make sure that this gets done on time? And here we have blocking things, overdue things, not started things, on track things, etc. So again, really, really powerful ways to use these tools. So the last example in here is a little bit of a different one. It's an employee handbook compliance audit, right? So I've worked with tons of firms. I mean, I've actually written employee handbooks in the past, especially if you're dealing with multiple state organizations, right? This can often be a challenge. You've got to look at federal regulations, you got to look at state regulations, right? They've got different compliance issues. And if you're doing a compliance audit, this can take, a paralegal or an associate quite a bit of time, and you might miss some state specific nuances or recent law changes. So you can take a draft handbook, put it into Claude Cowork or into Claude Code, and say, hey, here's the states that this company operates in. I want you to run a section by section audit against federal law and applicable state laws in recent regulatory development. So go search the web, go look for recent things, and give me a severity ranked flag list of all the things that have to change in here. So let me go over here to Cowork for a second. I'm going to go into this last section, section 10. And I'm just going to go ahead and open it up here. I'll make it easy. And so here's the employment handbook, right? The executive summary, and this is really important. This 2024 handbook cannot be distributed in its current form, right? It contains several provisions that are facially unenforceable in California, one provision that's likely voids, federal stuff, and a cluster of emissions that create material penalty exposure under California, Oregon, and federal law. So it went through section by section, identified all these things. And again, if you're doing this kind of analysis, in transactions, helping clients, if you're acquiring companies, being able to look across these things and do these things, again, is incredibly, incredibly important. And the prompt for this one, just to go back and cover this, is, I went in, I basically said, look, I want you to review, the attached employee handbook. They're a multi-state employer. They've got operations in Oregon, California, and Texas. You'll see it didn't flag any Texas thing. I don't know what that says about Texas law, but it found things in California and Oregon. I want you to go through and do all these things. Identify the highest risk issues, flag missing policies, identify provisions that are unenforceable, right? Look at the EEOC, and identify things in different jurisdictions, things like that, that I care about. So again, another really powerful use case for what we're doing there. So what was in here today, there were 10 demos across the transactional arc. There were drafting and review areas. There was due diligence items. There are close and regulatory things to focus on. Um, Things that I would do on Monday, right? Think about what plan you have. Again, make sure you've got a Teams or a business or an enterprise plan for any client confidential work. Pick a demo from today. Go try one of these things. Put in, your actual data. You can take one of these sample prompts, tailor it for your actual work, and then go review the output, right? See what this looks like. What is it doing? Share the results with a colleague. Talk about it. What worked? What different work? Did you have to do more or less rework than you might have had to have done, if you had done this on your own? And then go pick the next workflow. So I always add these with, if you're looking for help, I do a lot of these CLE events. I do a lot of executive workshops for firms. So if you want to come in and really understand what AI can do for you and help understand your firm's roadmap, I do these 2.5 hour workshops. I do firm-wide training for a lot of organizations. And for a selected few audiences, I will do AI case support where I help them day to day working on particular cases. My contact info is here. One of the things that was mentioned up front was my newsletter is at smithsteven.com. I'm going to pull it up for 1 second only because, so this is a completely free resource. I publish a ton of free content and I talk about, the copy and paste issues, Google's products, your competitors are running AI agents, design stuff. One I wanted to highlight was this is a whole article on Claude for Word, the add-in, but there's a really big one on privacy. So every 6 months, I go through and I update all the privacy policies and all the vendors. And this is really important for all firms. This went through and looked at, ChatGPT, the free tiers, the consumer tiers, the business tiers, right? And it talks about, can they train on your data? What are your terms of service you're under, right? What are the different security policies? So just again, it's a free resource. It goes through everything. It's all out there and available. Feel free to subscribe if you want, and I'll never charge for it, but it's just something that's quite useful. And that's it. So I apologize that my video was not working today. I'm going to stop sharing so I can open up and see questions. I know I went through a ton of stuff really, really fast, and I'm going to ask, the host and stuff, because I can't see all the questions right now. Were there questions or things that came through as part of the presentation today?
Yes, so we had quite a few questions.
Okay.
I have one from Larry Webb asking, what version of AI is appropriate for solo attorneys? The team is a 5-user license.
Um, you still need to go use a Teams one from either Anthropic or from ChatGPT. So the minimum amount that you can subscribe to with Claude is 5 people. And it's $30 a month. So you're talking about $150 a month to get commercial grade, security. It gives you privilege, your stuff is protected. Do not use the consumer ones. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough again and again. There was the Hefner ruling out in New York, a month or month and a half ago. If you want to use ChatGPT, the minimum is just 2 licenses to get on a business plan there. So you're looking at, 50 or $60 a month. So it's not materially more expensive than a consumer grade plan, but you get far, far more protection. So please, please use those.
Thank you. And it looks like we
Yeah.
have another question. It looks like Claude has access to quote unquote market standards, et cetera, in a corporate setting. What about a more specialized area like entertainment transactions?
So if you have data sources that can connect to, or if you've, downloaded them or purchased those, you can actually tie Claude into an incredible amount of data sources. So they've tied into most of the public financial sources at this point. I mean, they tie into PitchBook and also, an S&P, also, again, all sorts of different data sources. If there's a dedicated one for entertainment that, you have a subscription to, Claude can actually operate as a web browser and go search the web and do things. But I would find out if that data source has something called an MCP, a Model Context Protocol, that allows you to actually have Claude talk to it directly. So without knowing the specific data source, I can't give you a more definitive answer. But they plug into so many data sources, and so many of these companies are making their tools available for searching for things like that.
Thank you. And it looks like we have another one. The LLC operating agreement that Claude drafted was based on a form you provided it, or did it create it itself? If the latter, where does it source the form from?
In this particular example, it created it on its own. So it's looked at all the training data that's out there around the world. I mean, basically, these tools today have been trained on everything it can find on the internet, and including tons and tons of private data sources that these companies provided as well. However, and this is what I tell my clients, if you have a dedicated, if you've already got an existing LLC document structure that you use, you can upload that as a reference source to Claude, and it will go ahead and actually use that as a reference starting point and fill out the terms and conditions and all the different things that you've got there. So it's actually quite good at using existing sources if you have that. So if you've got great sources, great terms and conditions, please use that as a source. Whether you use Claude or use ChatGPT, it can go use that. If you don't give it a source, it will go look at all of its deep knowledge and all of its training data and come up with the best construction it can for you.
Great, thank you. And then I have another
Sure.
question. I've been saving my contract clauses as Outlook entries on Microsoft Outlook. Can I have
Mhm.
Claude scrape them from my Outlook file?
So, without knowing how it's specifically saved, I don't want to give you a 100% answer yes, but Claude can connect into Microsoft Outlook securely, and it uses all your existing, enterprise permissions and things like that, and it can read your information. So, again, depending on where you've saved it in Outlook, my assumption would probably be yes, but you'd have to confirm that. But it does have connectors into Outlook, and I will say it does not send email, so it has read-only access to Outlook, your email, and your calendar. Whereas if you're a Gmail shop, it can actually send emails for you. But I actually like the security of having the read-only. But again, depending where you've saved it, it should probably be able to read it no problem, assuming you connect it to there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I think
Sure.
this goes hand in hand with another question. Can Claude monitor my work in a Word document in real time and provide feedback?
Yes. So if you open up the Word document, so what I could do, hang on, I'll share my screen one more time here just as a starting point. Hold on, because that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that. Go back to sharing my desktop for 1 second here. So if I am in Word, and if I've opened up Claude here, right? Anything that I'm working on in Claude, Claude has visibility to. So it wouldn't like if I went and changed the clause. Oh, sorry. Let me go back into Word. Oh, come on, come back up, Word. I don't know where. There we go. If I was changing something in here, right, and I said, "Hey, Claude, go change this," right, it would see that. If I wanted it to give me feedback, I would actually have to tell it, but I could say, "Hey, I just made a bunch of changes, a bunch of changes to this doc. Let me know what you think," right? You could, I mean, I won't finish typing up, but you could actually go ask that. It would do that. So it has complete knowledge of everything that's in that Word document, all the track changes, all the comments, everything. So you could ask it real time, "Hey, what do you think of the changes that I made?" But you would do that through the add-in in Word itself, specifically the Claude add-in for Word. Yep. But great question.
Great. And it looks like we have a couple questions regarding the prompts for today's
Mhm.
session. If there was a way to get a link to the Word document or that for as different examples or you know.
Yeah, if you send me just shoot me an email and I'm happy to share the document. I didn't include it in the regular download package that I sent to the BHBA, but if you're interested in it, because I created this morning because I figured it'd be useful to see it all in one place. So if you're interested in it, just shoot me an email. The contact info is on the back of the slide. It's just steve@intelligencebyintent.com, and I'm more than happy to send it to you because I'm a huge believer in sharing the stuff. I think it's really important.
All right, I have another question. Do you tell Claude it is quote unquote under Delaware law, end quote? And if so, do you worry about the future E&O claim that you were trying to quote to AI practice Delaware law without being licensed in Delaware, assuming you were only California licensed?
I'm not sure I exactly understand the question. I mean, look, Claude will tell you it's not a lawyer, right? And in theory, theoretically, it doesn't give legal advice, right? You're the attorney. You're theoretically asking for questions, for insights, and for input. I mean, you could tell it, "Hey, I'm working on an organization that is headquartered in Delaware, so I want you to focus on Delaware law," right? And it will do its best job to do that. But at the end of the day, it can't give legal advice, right? It can help you craft documents and create content. But that's why I say to everyone, human review after all the stuff, you're the one that has to own this. But it does know the difference between, say, California law and New York law and Texas law and Delaware law. And if you tell it to look at particular laws in certain areas, it will certainly do that.
And let's see here. How effective have these prompts for other tools such as Copilot?
So I will give you my slight editorial answer here. Copilot is not nearly as strong a model as Claude is natively or as ChatGPT is natively. Um, in fact, Microsoft Copilot is actually using ChatGPT and Claude models in the background, but you don't always get access to the same level of thinking and adaptive capability that you get in using these. So I would say you could try them. I seriously doubt you're going to get the same results. I have almost every organization I've worked with has moved away from, at least at the moment, using Copilot because they have not delivered nearly as strong of AI capability as the Frontier Labs, ChatGPT, and Anthropic have.
Alrighty. Then I have who owns the info generated via our prompts, and how protected is the knowledge and source info we would be using in our prompts?
So, assuming that you are using, one of the team slash business slash enterprise subscriptions, that you own that, right? That you own the input, you own the output. They don't train on it, they can't see it. There's no third parties that can access it. So that's yours. And so anything you put in there, again, not using a consumer version, right? So if you're using the free version or the $20 a month consumer one, you're at risk. They can train on it. You don't have the same rights. You've got to be on one of the commercial subscriptions and then you own it and it's your input and your output.
Right. Do you have an opinion on Westlaw's AI component, which to me seems clunky and dated? How about other pairing AI platforms to test one against another and to use the comparison of a tool for our own editing?
So I don't have a specific opinion on Westlaw's AI component. I know historically they were using some older models. I mean, obviously, like their moat is their data source, right? Which is super important. I don't know if they've updated the more recent models. I mean, they can also hallucinate just like all these other current models are. I will tell you one of the best practices that I use that most of the lawyers I work with now have started to use is they actually often subscribe to two of these enterprise tools and you actually use them with each other in conjunction because even though they may have been trained on a lot of similar data, they've been trained differently and they come up with different insights. And I find that I'll go run an analysis on Claude and then I'll go dump into the most advanced version of ChatGPT and say, hey, here's an analysis I'm running, look for weaknesses, look for changes, look for things that I might have missed. And it will often go find things. Then I'll take that result and put it back into Claude and say, hey, here's some things that were missed, incorporate this with your existing one, right? These tools work incredibly, incredibly well with each other and you can get absolutely incredible outputs when you do things like that. So, but again, I don't have a strong opinion on Westlaw's current AI. I don't, they don't typically publish, what they're using all the time. So, if you're happy with it, use it. But again, I mean, to your point, it's clunky and outdated or clunky and dated. I find that the Frontier Labs, are innovating super fast. They're adding things every day and they're trying to make, integration with Microsoft Office and other things just super valuable and super easy to use. All
Alrighty.
right. Let's do like
I
probably one more if we have time
One
for one
more.
more.
All
Yeah.
right. So I do have one more regarding, I guess, information with Claude. Is there a risk of Claude gaining access to more data on one system that allowed referencing the Mac Mini surge, or is that only for agent building?
Great question. It's funny. I actually have a Mac Mini on my desk running a ton of agents, and it's completely contained. So, I mean, I actually happen to have a version of Claude running on it, but it's completely separate. So when you're using one of these enterprise tools, it's if you're using the chat interface, it only has what you upload and what you have in the chat. If you're using the co-work feature, you actually have to explicitly give it permission to work in different directories. It can't just suddenly say, hey, I have complete access to your hard drive, right? You explicitly give it permission. So it's not going to go off as only have access to all your other data or all your other folders. They have really locked it down. And if, for example, you are a Microsoft shop and you've got, Microsoft Enterprise logins and you're using OneDrive and other things, it inherits all those permissions. So it can't look across and say, oh, hey, I want to go see what's in Joe's files in his directories. No, ChatGPT and Anthropic are very, very focused on security, and there's no risk of it suddenly going off and getting access to other things. So, well, look, again, thank you for the time today. I know I spoke pretty quickly. I hope this was incredibly valuable. I try to pick, transactional use cases that would resonate with the group. And again, if you're interested in the prompts, please reach out to me. I'm happy to share those. And again, thank you for the time. Appreciate it.
This concludes today's presentation. Thank you again, Stephen Smith, for an excellent presentation, and thank you so much to our audience. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.